is Scott Riggan. I have been serving in worship ministry for a lot of years. And let me tell you just a little bit about my background before I get started. I attended Boise Bible College and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Studies. I never intended to work at a church. I did 6 years of middle school ministry while I was in Bible college and for a few years afterwards. But my plan had been all along that I would work in the music industry, specifically the Christian music industry in Nashville, Tennessee, where I ended up living and working for a long time, a number of years. I was with a band that toured all over the country, 150 to 200 days a year, doing a lot of ministry work. And I wrote for a publishing company as a songwriter. And ultimately ended up deciding that I wanted to live in Idaho to raise my kids. That touring was great, but it was also a real challenge when my daughter was born, and I realized I'm going to be a stranger to this kid if I keep this up. And so that facilitated a change for me. So I moved back to Idaho, believing that that would be the death knell for a music career, because Idaho is not the cultural center of the universe. It's a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place. But there's a reason why Nashville and New York and LA are the music centers that they are. And Emmett, Idaho is not it's not on that list. So, but I was very fortunate in that shortly after I moved to Idaho that I had an inexplicable hit song on the radio that led to a number of years of really fruitful and busy ministry. I ended up joining my church on staff. I had not intended to join the staff of the church, but I was invited to come on staff when my mother-in-law became very ill. She had had breast cancer and recovered from that, but then she had pancreatic cancer, and I canceled 4 or 5 months worth of shows in order to stay home so that my wife could take care of her. And my good friend, the pastor of this church, reached out to me and said, listen, we could use your help, and I think you could use ours right now. So at least for the time being, why don't you work with us? And I never left. So I stayed there from that point on and was there for 16 years until very recently. Now, the first year that I was on staff at that church, Eagle Christian Church, I was the assistant worship minister. And within a few months, I was going to take over the program, and that worship pastor was going to plant a church in Middleton, Idaho. And then he didn't. And I chafed under his leadership because I was this young guy who knew how it should be done, and I had so many ideas and so many things I wanted to change. And looking back now, I see how much damage I would have done in my ignorance if I had not had his very wise and calm mentorship. An example of this is we had a volunteer on our team, a gentleman named Gary, who I can pretty much testify is the worst drummer that I've personally ever encountered in my life. However, he's also a retired fighter pilot. And so he's, maverick. He's never wrong. He's very aggressive. And it was kind of a nightmare to work with the guy. And so I was complaining to my boss, Mike Whitford. Some of you may know Mike. Mike was my boss at the time, and we have since become just very close friends, good friends. But at the time, I was telling Mike, listen, I don't think I can survive another week playing with this guy on the team, Gary. So can we find a way to fire him? Can we fire this volunteer? And Mike said, well, listen, there's some things you don't know. I'm on the phone every day with Gary, and we pray together all the time. I've been counseling Gary and his wife and helping them restore their marriage. Gary is someone who only recently came to the Lord. He's been in church his whole life, but never had any kind of discipling, never had a relationship with Christ in any real way. And I just look at taking him off the team as something that would just damage all of that progress. It would, and as he was talking, I realized, I had this realization, oh, Mike, you care about Gary, because I don't care about Gary. And I realized I was looking at everyone on the team as tools that I would use in order to accomplish my ministry goals. And some tools were better than others, and Gary was a broken tool that I wanted to just throw away. That was the beginning of my realization that I needed to develop a pastor's heart, and that was a big part of the job of being a worship pastor. Slowly came to understand that if there were a Venn diagram, the two big circles, and traveling professional singer-songwriter, musician, and local church worship pastor. That Venn diagram, that little sliver where they overlap, it's very small. It's very small. Most of the skill set I had developed over here, it didn't really translate. A little bit of musical stuff, but for the most part, it's volunteer management, and it's discipling, and it's pastoring, and I had not developed those skills. And so in the early part of my ministry, I just didn't know much about that stuff. I want to clarify something before we go any further. I'm going to be using a term imprecisely, and I'm going to do it, and this is my apology for that. The word worship. I think most of us in the room would acknowledge that we use that word carelessly. Worship is not simply limited to music or singing to God. In Scripture, the Greek and Hebrew words that we translate for worship have some very, very rich meanings: to bow and to submit, to serve, to honor. And music is one way that we express that. But it's a much bigger thing. In fact, there's an exercise that I love doing. You take Romans 12:1. You're familiar with that scripture? I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And the exercise is to take out the word bodies and to say, offer your voices, offer your songs as living sacrifice, holy, and this is your spiritual act of worship. That's so much smaller than offer your whole self. So when we say worship, what we should be saying is worship is a life lived as a living sacrifice, a life lived in submission to God. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to use it in a more imprecise way, and we're just talking about the musical or artistic or creative portion of worship in a service. Just as a way to start things off in a really positive and uplifting way, I'm going to read from Amos, because when you think of the Old Testament prophet Amos, you think of good times and great humor. No, you don't. You think of dark things. Amos 5:21 through 23. I despise your feasts. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I'm not going to even look at them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. And I think when the people of Israel heard the prophet Amos say all of this, they would have been shocked, they would have been offended, they would have probably been angry, and they would have been dismayed because they were doing everything that they were supposed to do. They were checking off every box. All the rituals, all the ceremonies, all the feasts and celebrations, all of these things that gave Israel a way to connect with God. They were doing those things with very careful observance. They were obeying the commands of God. Exodus 23, Leviticus 23, Deuteronomy 16, all of those things. But God saw their religious ceremonialism. He saw how empty it was, how rote it was, that it was completely disconnected from the heart, that outwardly the worship seemed acceptable, but inwardly their hearts were far from God, and their worship didn't extend beyond ceremony into their lives. So I want to talk today about how we in the church can use our creative gifts, especially music, to serve and honor God with excellence. It's a good thing to serve God with excellence, but I think the example from Amos, if we're just putting on a really great, really slick show, God's not going to be pleased with that, and it's not going to achieve kingdom goals. So it's a critical thing that we approach that with care. I want to pray as we begin. So, Lord God, I want to thank you today that we get to talk about this and wrestle with what it means to actually honor you with the gifts that you have given us. And Lord, I think it tells us something about you, and this is such a sweet thing to know, that you gift us with the ability to create something visually beautiful, or to create something that is stirring musically with our voices or an instrument or whatever. You give us these gifts, and then you are honored when we use those gifts in your service. And that's beautiful. Thank you, God. Help our congregations draw closer to you because of the work that we do. Help us to honor and glorify you with these gifts, and to communicate the gospel to our communities that you have planted us in. We thank you, God. We love you, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I've got a couple of things that I want to talk about. It's a little bit scattershot, so stay with me. But before we talk about anything else in relationship to worship,
I think the vision of a worship ministry needs to be articulated. And so I don't know how many of you lead worship at your churches or have? Okay, a little bit. Okay, all right. So I think this is for me, this is a really fun conversation to have with worship leaders and with senior pastors, because what I find is so much of the time everyone is operating on assumptions but no clarity, no conversations about what are we trying to accomplish? What is it that we're wanting to do as we lead worship for our congregations? So when I speak to worship pastors, what does your leadership at your church want to accomplish? What are they envisioning the worship in your church, the music or what other creative things, art in your service, what is that going to accomplish? Are you aligned with your leadership, or do you have your own agenda? And I have met worship leaders who are trying to work like sleeper agents, where we're going to show them how it's done. Our leadership wants this, but we're going to do this other thing. And oh my gosh, guys, there's a reason why they call it the worship wars, and it breaks my heart to see the kind of dissonance that takes place in those situations. The absence of clarity just leaves so much room for division. So the big question at this point is, and I feel like so many churches don't know that they need to wrestle with this question, but as a worship pastor, as a senior pastor, do you want your congregation to listen to a performance, or are you calling your congregation to engage and participate? Now remember, think about our culture. We live in a culture that has increasingly become entirely spectators. We go to events and watch other people do things. And church is one of the few places, particularly singing, it's one of the few places in our world, in our culture, that we say, hey everybody, let's sing together. Where else in your life do you do that? Nobody's gathering around the piano in their living room and singing songs anymore. That just doesn't happen for the most part. Now, I married someone who was not interested in music at all, and that was one of the things I loved about her. She was totally not impressed with me as a musician. I loved that. We talked about other things, which is so great. But I did imagine that I would have a house full of instruments kind of strewn around the house, and that my children would be into it didn't happen. It didn't happen. I'm the only one who loves music in my home. I actually went a week where I deliberately didn't play any music in the house just to see what would happen. And I kind of went crazy. I had to go out to the car and just listen to get a hit of some music, And at the end of the week, I was like, did you guys not even notice there was no music? And they didn't. They didn't even notice it. So people are wired differently, right? I just sort of assume everyone feels the same way I do about music. But we live in a culture that continually puts us in the position of being spectators, and we ask people to come to the church, and I don't think there's a right or wrong here. Well, I kind of do, but my preference is I believe we're called to engage and participate. There are a lot of churches, though, that have chosen, or maybe not chosen, but just by default have become places where a congregation stands and watches a worship team perform music. And as a leadership, worship pastor, senior minister, elders, need to wrestle with that and decide, what do we want to do? There are several approaches that churches take as they answer the question of how are we going to present worship to our congregation? How are we going to engage people? And I'm not here to tell you what I think is the right way necessarily. I'm not sure there is a right way to do it. In different environments, different communities, you're going to see different things be effective. But there are three general ways that I've seen churches manage worship, and particularly worship style. There are a lot of churches that have felt, and I want to be careful that this doesn't sound harsh, I'm identifying what I've seen. A lot of churches where their priority has been to keep the core group of their church happy, out of fear that if they don't keep that core group happy, that those folks will leave, particularly when the finances of the church are dependent upon that core group. That core group may not intend to hold the church hostage to their preferences, but in reality, that's sometimes how it plays out. Another way that churches sort of organize themselves around worship is cool church. We're going to be the church that everyone looks at and, oh, those guys are cool. Those guys are awesome. I've been in churches where no one under 30 is allowed on the worship team. I actually know a church that checks the labels on your clothes before you go on stage to make sure that the clothing you're wearing is cool enough. And, you know, that's all in service of trying to reach a fickle, young, unchurched world. So I understand where they're coming from. So I'm not judging it, although you can probably hear the judgment in my voice, but that is one of the ways that churches wrestle with this, is we're going to be cool. Another way is to create a blended worship service. And what that really means is it's about compromise. It's about trying to not necessarily satisfy everyone, because you'll never, everyone knows this, you're never going to satisfy everyone with worship style, but trying to compromise, trying to provide, trying to offer to everyone something of what they prefer. Now, I've had some conversations this week with a few people about this, but there's something that I heard Paul Balash, who is a worship songwriter and a great teacher, I've heard him talk about a few times. He says, worship leaders, your job is similar to that of a caterer for a family reunion. You have this family, diverse family coming for the reunion, and you've got some kids, so you want to put out some hot dogs, you want some chips, you want some things that they're going to gravitate to. You also want to have some spicier dishes, some more interesting and unusual things. And you've got Uncle Fred, who is a vegetarian, and you're not going to say, yeah, I'll just put out some carrots, maybe some celery, and that'll be good enough for Uncle Fred. No, you create something for him, a dish or dishes that you know he's going to see and know they cared about me, they thought about me, I'm included. And so when you look at that buffet table of all these dishes, there may not be one dish there that everybody says, yeah, I love that. But the whole family knows I'm cared for here. They love me. I'm part of this family. That, I think, is a good description of what the blended approach looks like. Frequently, churches will do a traditional service, and then they'll also do a more contemporary service. I actually was at a church one time, it was a Nazarene church, and they had 7 completely distinct services. They took this to extremes. Now, they had a very traditional choir in choir robes with an organ and, very, very, very high church service. They also had a Southern Gospel Quartet service. They had a blended service, kind of like what I described. They had a service that they described as a melt your face off service, where it was very aggressive, loud, rock music and lights and smoke and the whole production. They even had a Sunday evening service that they called their contemplative service that included some candles and chanting. So they were covering everything. And I was there as a guest for that weekend and participated in, I think, 2 of the services. Went to lunch with some of the worship staff afterwards, and I just had questions. I wanted to find out all about this process. And the question that I asked that kind of got a really interesting answer was this. I said, would you do this again? Would you fragment your congregation this way? And they said, no, never. We regret this. What we did is truly fragment our congregation based on their preferences. And what we didn't know was that we would be creating an expectation that at this church, whatever I want, I'm entitled to. And so you would think that when you give everyone exactly what they say they want, that they would be happy, but they never were. We also, he said, they said, we have young families who have no relationship of any kind to older couples. We've taken our church and completely created these little, ghettos where these relationships just can't even. So they said we would never do it again, but we don't know how to stop. We are kind of stuck with this. So that's one of the challenges when you try to specifically give everyone what they say they want. So once you and your leadership have determined, do you want to have spectators or do you want to have engaged participants? And you figured out what style are we going to go with? Are we going to have that blended style? Are we going to be doing something like Cool Church? Are we going to be just trying to appeal to the people who have financial power in the church? What are we going to do? After that, it's time to nail down what the worship pastor's actual job is. And I love talking about that. We had a great conversation in the podcast yesterday about this. I love this. I like to use the word curation. That the worship pastor's job is not to pick songs for Sunday morning. The worship pastor's job is to curate a repertoire. Curate songs, choose songs, select carefully songs that we are going to put in the mouths, the words that we're going to put in the mouths of the congregation as they sing to our God. And to be casual and careless about that is, I think, a grave mistake. So when I talk about curation, that suggests that there are all these options out there, and I'm going to selectively choose the ones that fit whatever my criteria is. So when I talk with worship pastors, I always say, you've got to figure out, with your pastor preferably, what is your criteria for choosing the songs, curating the songs that you're going to ask your congregation to sing. And the first thing for me is always theology. Do these songs, there are a lot of great songs, catchy songs that don't really say much. Maybe you don't want to do those songs, but at least be aware as you dig through them. What do these songs actually say? Do they have good theology? Is there something erroneous or maybe even dangerous in a song? Curate the songs. That means I'm going to carefully select those songs. Good theology, are they also singable? We're hearing a lot of great songs on the radio, and people want to do them in church. But those are professional singers. Those songs are written specifically to show off their voice, which is nothing wrong with that. You know how thrilling it is to listen to someone who can just sing the heck out of a song, right? Well, worship pastors often are in that role because they have a set of talents. They have a musical ability. They're able to sing really well. But a congregation is made up of average, ordinary people who have not had vocal training and may not have a 5-octave vocal range. So many of our songs are not built to serve our congregations. So as you're curating the songs, good theology, is it actually singable? Is it relevant to this congregation, my congregation, in my community? Is it relevant here? There may be a fantastic song. There was a song that I really love. Has anyone ever heard Death Was Arrested? Oh, I love that song. I chose not to introduce that song at my church. And it broke my heart because I loved it so much, because I realized that carelessly, the previous 3 songs that I had added all were resurrection themed. And, you know, that's a great theme, but we need to be singing about so many things. We need to be singing about the greatness of God. We need to be, you know what I'm saying? So I chose not to do a song that I actually think is a fantastic song, because I had kind of carelessly chosen others that already covered that ground. So is this song going to be relevant right now to my congregation? The last thing is I instruct worship leaders to impose some organization on themselves, to be strategic about how they introduce songs. If your church leads a song, brand new song for the congregation once, and then it's a month later before they sing it again, the congregation is never going to learn that song. You have to be strategic about how you introduce it and have a plan for how frequently you're going to do it for a while. And here's the challenge. Those of you who have led worship, you know this, I'm sure. We get so tired of these songs because we have charted them out, we've rehearsed them alone on our own, then we rehearse with the band, and then we lead them in the church service. And the truth is, by the time the congregation has caught on to it, that's right about the same time that we never want to have to do it again. Truly, you just get really tired of them. And so I learned through experience that I can't trust my gut about a song and about whether that song is getting too old. I have talked with churches I was at a church not long ago who sent me their repertoire, and I wanted to do we do that song all the time. And I checked their planning center records to see how frequently they'd done it once every year for 3 years. Once a year for 3 years. Yeah, that's one of our core songs. We know that one really well. I don't know how that congregation could possibly know that song. But their perception is, I know that song, they must know that song. So, got to be strategic about how you actually introduce and teach your congregation those songs. So, curating the songs, it involves all of those things. Selectively choosing songs based on theology. Is it singable? Is it useful for this congregation? Is it relevant to where we are as a body? I loved it when my pastor was about to enter into a year-long study of the book of Acts, which was great. We loved it. And King of Kings by Hillsong came out right then, and it is pretty much the perfect song for the establishment of the church. It was so great. And that came out and I was like, well, I have to do that song. That absolutely is the theme song for this entire series. So it's a lot of fun, and it's exciting when you actually start to look for those connections. So the worship pastor's job is what we're talking about. Curating the songs for the congregation. Second, this seems obvious, you're going to lead the congregation. which means you have to cultivate your skills as a musician, as a singer, as a communicator. You have to love your congregation. Now that's when I've had a lot of deep conversations with worship pastors who have sometimes an antagonistic relationship with at least part of the congregation. And I'll tell you, if you are going to serve your congregation, you have to choose to love them. Honestly, I always tell worship leaders, if you're going to take the job, it comes with a uniform. And that uniform is a target that's on your back. And if you're unwilling to wear that uniform, you probably need to say no to the job. And that's just because we're dealing with human beings who have deep love and preference for the thing that they love. And if the music that they love is not something you're going to lead, they're gonna be disappointed. My mom and dad are in their 80s, and if my church were to sing a Gaither song, they would weep for days because they love it so much. And I realize there are songs that just gut me because of how, right now, Goodness of God is my theme song, and I have a hard time even getting through that. I will love that song for the rest of my life. When I'm in my 80s and someone plays that song, if that should happen, I'm going to have that same reaction. That's how we're wired. That's how music and art work within us on an emotional level, on a spiritual level. And so we need to love our congregation, cultivate love, even for your detractors. I tell this story. I think this is a good example of some of what we as worship pastors sometimes face. Years ago, in my church, we had a very small 350-seat auditorium, and we were moving into a 1,400-seat auditorium that we just built. So we were about to transition. So we had this smaller auditorium, smaller stage, and we had this small, tiny little electronic drum kit, which those are kind of awful, but they are useful because you can maintain the volume at a reasonable level. They take up less space, all of that. But we were about to move into the big auditorium, so we sold that and we bought a beautiful big drum kit. And we had it set up on the stage. We had a grand piano and the drum kit. There was barely room for anybody else on the stage. So this one weekend, the first weekend we had the drum kit on stage, as people came in, it was the first thing that you saw. It was right under some lighting, and I know as people came in, they were like, whoa, something's happening here today. What's going on? And so that was a Saturday night. Right before service started, my drummer called me from the bathroom where he was throwing up, and he said, I am not going to be able to play after all. I'm so sorry. So the band adapted to not having a drummer that day, and that whole weekend we played, did our worship set. Everything was okay. It was fine. And on Monday, I went and checked my box, and I had 24 comment cards that said the drums were too loud. No one played the drums. And here's the thing. I don't believe that I had 24 people who were just dumb. No, not at all. These are, normal human beings who their perception as they came in was set, oh boy, it's going to be loud today. And their perception influenced how they actually experienced that service. Those people believed that they were hearing loud drums. Now, I pair this with a story about my mom. I grew up in Redding, California, if you know where that is, and I went home to my church for a big homecoming thing. My daughter and I made a road trip out of it and hung out, which was a lot of fun. But we went to my church, and we were there for this homecoming event where people from all the generations of that church came to worship together. And there was a Sunday morning service, just a regular service, and then the event that night. And they had asked me to sing a few songs at that, so we were there. Sunday morning, I had on my phone a dB meter, which measures the volume of sound in the room. And I was just curious what the volume would be like. And so it was about 65 decibels in the room before the music started, just people talking. The music started Sunday morning, and it didn't actually change. It was very, very quiet. Now, there was a drummer in an enclosure. I couldn't hear anything that the kid played. It looked like a high school kid, and he was pounding away. Couldn't hear a thing. There were a bunch of guitar players, a bunch of singers, just full band. I could only hear a few people, the leader and his wife, and one guitar, I think. So it was, and at lunch, my mom said, today I just thought that drummer was going to take my head off. And I was trying to listen for the drummer. I couldn't hear him at all, but I also know better than to argue with my mom, so I didn't say anything. So Sunday night, Now we're at the big homecoming event, and oh my goodness, it was loud. I pulled out my dB meter on my phone, and it was well over 100 decibels, which is loud, guys. Loud, really loud. A lot louder than any of our church services ever are, typically. So I asked my mom afterwards, because it was a full band, and it was just so loud, and the drums were big. They were huge. And I asked my mom about it. She said, oh, I just wish it could be that way all the time. And here's what I figured out. My mom doesn't like Hillsong, Chris Tomlin, Phil Wickham, a lot of the modern music, which is what they did Sunday morning. So you can't make that stuff quiet enough to make her happy, because she doesn't like it. But when the roll is called up yonder, I'll fly away. All those camp meeting songs from 100 years ago, oh, that's her jam. And so it wasn't loud because she liked it. So what I've learned is that people's perception is absolutely influenced by what they think is going to happen, and that I have no chance at convincing someone to like something that they do not like. So, as a worship pastor, my position is not, let me explain to you why you're wrong about not liking this, which is, I think, the way a lot of worship pastors approach this subject. Instead, it became, how do I bring you into understanding the vision of what we're doing? How can I listen to you, let you know I care about you, figure out how I can continue to serve you who we disagree, and at the same time draw you into the vision. And a lot of times what I talk about when I talk with especially older folks who don't like modern presentations of music and worship, we talk about their kids and their grandkids. And again, I can't convince them to like something they don't like, but I can get them to understand why we might be doing something that's not their favorite way of doing things. So, worship pastor's job is curate those songs, lead and love your congregation, and then it's your volunteers, recruiting, training, and shepherding. I had no training in volunteer management, and that's everything I do in worship ministry is volunteer management. It is recruiting and training and shepherding volunteers, developing leaders, equipping them for ministry with your support. All right, so what I'd like to do now, I'm hoping we'll have a minute for some question and response stuff later on. I like that so much better than question and answer. So much better. Takes a lot of pressure off. But what I want to do is I have, when I onboard people onto my worship team, there's a video, I use Loom, and I film a video where I express to them, here is the vision of the team, this is what we want to be like. So as you are potentially entering our team, let's answer some questions ahead of time. And what I found is that this helps eliminate a lot of the conflict when someone joins the team and wants to try to grab the steering wheel and turn it somewhere different. If I can establish right from the beginning, here's who we are, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And so this is the worst logo that you've ever seen. I spent 2 minutes creating this thing. It actually looks like a lot of church logos I've seen, but in the interest of not having my old church's logo on there, I thought I should put something else up there. So I'm just going to talk through this and talk through the onboarding process. This normally would be a video that I would send to someone who's applying for the worship team. So, hello there, my name's Scott Riggan. Thanks for taking a moment to learn about the worship arts ministry at our church. Along with this video, you should have received an online application, a link to an application. Just take a few minutes to fill that out. You click submit, and then I will spring into action to get back with you right away. We're going to set an appointment with you to get together and start getting acquainted. And just an aside here, never let an interested volunteer wait for you to respond to them. If you wait a day, if you wait a week, the odds of them continuing to be interested diminish dramatically. So I try to get back to people right now. I want to spring into action, literally. Okay, back to the video. So I want to share with you a little bit about what our team is like and what our job on this team is. This might seem like a really obvious statement, but let me explain what we are here to do. The role of the worship arts team is to facilitate corporate worship. We want our congregation to be engaged, to be participating in worship. And we're not here to put on a show. We're not here to perform songs for spectators. And so, yes, my bias is fairly clear at this point, I think. We're not here to perform worship songs for spectators. And all of our decisions will be weighed against that as our priority. This is going to impact how we use lighting. It's going to impact how the audio is managed. It's going to impact the way we set up our stage, the songs we choose, what key they are in. For this body in this community, what will help our people engage in worship? And conversely, what will hinder them from engaging in worship? So we work to eliminate any obstacles that might inhibit worship, putting songs and keys that most people can sing in, maintaining an environment that enhances the worship experience, and that means appropriate lighting, appropriate sound. What we've learned is that if the music is too quiet, people become self-conscious and stop singing. If the music is too loud, it feels like a concert and they stop singing. And so in our culture, we got to dial it in. For this particular church and this community, it's going to be different from community to community. Remember that. For this particular community, we've learned that if we set it at a certain place, people are more likely to feel less self-conscious and participate. We avoid anything that could distract, and that could be your choice of clothing. That could be singing, this is the technical term, too fancy. So if a fantastic singer is adding so much stuff, you know what I'm talking about, it can be really entertaining and engaging, but sometimes it's off-putting and it's hard for people to follow, and they just feel like they're seeing a concert. So I have learned that sometimes the best singers are not really all that good at leading worship, and sometimes just a fairly modestly talented singer just absolutely is capable of doing it. Anyway, that's an aside. All of this is with the goal of helping our congregation to sing their praises to God. Now, you should have also received a document, the Worship Arts Team Description. It's a document that explains the kind of team that we aspire to be. Now, guys, this is the bulk of what I want to communicate to someone that I'm potentially onboarding onto the team. Right now, I'd like to just walk through that document and tell you a little bit more about the Worship Arts team. Who are we as a team? We are one team that consists of musicians, tech operators, and singers. And we partner together to lead the congregation in worship and produce excellent services. Every role on our team is valued. There is not a hierarchy. There is not a situation where a singer is the most important person and we all defer to that person. It is a team effort. Whether you're running camera, playing instruments, singing, running sound, whatever it is, you are fulfilling a vital role. Now, just an aside, one of the reasons I emphasize that so much is it's super common in churches to have kind of antagonistic camps, singers, musicians, and tech operators who don't really feel like they belong on the same team. And I've spent years trying to break that down in my church. And then moving on, who will support you? You'll be supported by me and the worship arts staff. And this is the point where I explain, at one time, I believed that my job was to surround myself with talented volunteers who could help me do my job of leading the congregation. And that sounds reasonable, right? I think that's probably the default position that most worship pastors kind of adopt. I'm going to find talented people who are going to help me do my thing. Over time, I've come to realize, looking through the lens of discipleship, everything that I do needs to be about equipping, recruiting, training, shepherding volunteers, and raising up leaders who are going to lead our congregation with my support. So I'm continually moving myself into a position in the background, supporting. That changed my ministry dramatically when I began to see everything through that lens of discipling. So how does this team operate? As I said, I'm wanting to describe the team that we aspire to be. We are team players, no divas. Have you been in a church where there was someone that everyone had to walk on eggshells around, and you felt like, oh, if we get that person upset, they're going to leave, and what would we do without them? You'll be better off without them. Ideally, you help coach them to overcome that. But the truth is, most of the time, those folks, if you do not continue to capitulate to their demands, they aren't going to be around. And I will tell you, that creates such a toxic environment when those folks are there. So we don't allow that. No divas. All team members are going to work to maintain an environment of mutual respect, a place of encouragement and support in submission to the vision and leadership of the church. we are team players, and then next, we value excellence. Remember, our goal is for a congregation that's engaged, a congregation that is not just a room full of spectators. We want them to be involved. And if we're going to do that with excellence, that means everyone on the team has to prepare and maintain a high level of skill. And so there is a school of thought that says, it's good enough for church. I hate that. I don't care for that at all. I want to bring people onto the team and train them and encourage them and help them to grow in their giftings. But what we do for the congregation and for the Lord, I want it to have a high bar of excellence. So we're going to that end, to help people prepare, we, on my staff, do a lot of work to provide tools and training. I spend 40% of my work week working with volunteers and doing training. And again, that's a way of discipling people. It's also a way of raising the bar and helping people to succeed. So we are team players, we value excellence, and we are servants. We don't operate independently. We're part of a community of faith. You have church worship teams that don't seem to actually belong to the rest of the church. They kind of are their own thing. I really encourage worship pastors to integrate the worship team into the life of the entire church. We're part of a community of faith. We're there to serve our God, our church, and one another. And so I encourage people to help assimilate new people onto the team, to be entirely, participating in every way in the life of the church, helping when there's a need that arises, that kind of thing. So we're team players, we value excellence, we are servants, and we are disciples. Now, this is not something that I, as the worship pastor, am able to evaluate on behalf of anybody. This is between you and Jesus. But we want people to know that we're here to grow together as disciples of Jesus. And so we define that as a disciple. A disciple is someone who is following Jesus, who is being transformed by Jesus, and who has joined on mission with Jesus. And so we ask people to attend, not just when they're scheduled on the worship team, but to be part of the life of that church, to be committed to growing as a follower of Christ, impacting others for him. And then a few years ago at my church, I started really emphasizing life groups. And out of our ministry, I believe 3 or 4 life groups of just musicians, singers, tech operators were birthed, in addition to the ones that were elsewhere. And it was such a good thing. And so I encourage people to just really get rooted in the community of the church. So we are team players. We value excellence. We are servants. We are disciples. That's the team that we aspire to be. That's just a very quick introduction to the ministry of worship arts at our church. Next steps, pray about serving on our worship team. Fill out that online application. Meet with me or one of the other worship arts staff. And that's how I begin introducing people. Now, I have been told, and I've learned that it is true of me, that I over-explain everything. And I know I come by this very naturally, because when I was taught when my dad taught me how to change the oil in my car, I was given the entire history of the automobile. So I realize that that's a part, but this presentation is after I spent hours paring it down. And the video itself was only 4 minutes long, so I kind of expanded it here. But that's how I started. And again, the reason is I want to cast vision for the people who are considering joining our team. Right from the very beginning, I want to send a message about who we are going to be, how we're going to operate, what our values are, what we're trying to accomplish. And what I found is that a lot of the folks joining our team, that this was incredibly helpful for them because they've been in other circumstances where everything was a lot more random and casual, and there was a lot of fighting, and they felt this could be a safe place for me to re-enter into ministry. And to me, that's incredibly important. So I wanted to go ahead and do, are we able to do a question and answer thing, or question and response thing? Okay. Do we do the cards, or do we just want to? It's a small group. We could just. I'll repeat the questions back. My kids were in 4-H. We have a little ranch, and so goats and horses and sheep and cows and chickens and everything. Sheep, ugh, I hate them. That is not a complimentary metaphor. You know that? It is not. If you've had any experience with sheep, they're horrible. Anyway, but yeah, any questions? I'd love to. Yes, Matt. So the question has been asked, how do you, that was a long question, how do you deal with people who are not on board with the vision and the way that you're doing that, and they're creating division and creating some strife on the team? That's essentially the question, yeah. Well, early on in my ministry, I saw conflict and hoped it would go away. That was my strategy. And let me tell you, it's a terrible strategy. It never works. In fact, what happens is that kind of conflict or whatever, it always festers, it always turns into something worse, and it spreads so that more and more people get hurt. So I learned that I had to put my big boy pants on and actually enter into that space with people and dialogue with people about conflict between team members, which I know is not your question, or talking about vision. You have people on your team who say, I just wish that we could rock a lot harder, or how come we don't, I had a guy who was a fantastic blues electric guitar player. The problem is he applied that to every song that we did, and it just didn't fit. And so we had to sit down and talk about it, and I said, I would love for you to remain on the team. I don't want you to leave, but I do want to coach you toward, and he was gone before I finished the sentence. I mean, so early in my ministry, I didn't really know how to handle that, and that is why this orientation came to be. It took some years to evolve, but I wanted to address some of those things ahead of time. And when something would come up, I would refer back to, well, remember when we first talked about vision? And this is the other thing, is this is the beginning of casting vision. It's not the end of it. The first time is not the only time that they hear this stuff. We would have meetings where we would talk about it. I would try to, in our rehearsal times, try to reinforce these ideas. And to, we had people on our team who served as coaches. So we had a guy who was our volunteer drum coach. And so he would work with the drummer on how we wanted to manage that area, bass player, guitar player, etc. Vocal coach who would work with the singers. All of that to help kind of really underscore the idea that that we have a really solid way that we want to do things. And so much of it is built around wanting, I don't want to put someone in a position where they're going to come up on stage and feel unprepared and unsupported, and they're going to embarrass themselves. I don't want that for the congregation. One of the things that my pastor has said right at the beginning when I first started, he said, you've got to eliminate the cringe. Because that feeling that people have out here when something embarrassing has happened on stage, you know what that feels like. It's an awful feeling. And he said, if you can just figure out how to eliminate that. But the problem is you have human beings on stage, so they're going to be, I'm going to say something stupid. I have so much grace for public speakers now because I have said the dumbest things. Today, probably, I may not know until I listen to the recording later. I don't know if I have the self-esteem to be able to listen to the recording later, but yeah, so primarily my approach now is to communicate early and often to head that kind of thing off. And the truth is, I've had very little since I really began establishing vision and clarity early on. I haven't had a whole lot of that. So early on I had a lot more because I wasn't very good at expressing that stuff. So, yeah. Yes? Mm-hmm. So Casey is asking or making the statement, as a worship leader, you focus on worship, on leading your congregation during your set. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Right. So the question is being asked when you are you're on the platform, you're leading your congregation, and you are juggling all the details, and kind of your mind is working through all the mechanics of what's happening. You're thinking about the guitar player who just played the wrong chord, and you're thinking about the misspelling that you just noticed on the screen, or whatever, things like that. How do you, while you are managing all of that, still enter into worship? Well, I think the answer that I have to that is that worship is not the emotional high that we sometimes think of it as. And so my act of service right now, as I am juggling all those things, is an act of worship. I always tell my worship team, our rehearsal time, that is an act of worship. It's not something separate from the moment, the magic moment when there's a congregation in the room. No, it's all part of that. Sitting at home in your basement, working through the electric guitar parts, that is an act of worship, and it's valued, and God is blessed by that. But there is, I do want to, so I'm not arguing with your question, but just I'm saying all of that. I think all that's true. However, I will tell you this: I have personally learned to experience some compartmentalization where I can. And I think this just comes from experience, where there's a part of my brain that is constantly working, thinking about what's happening on the team and my own, struggle to play that chord or whatever. For me right now, I'm dealing with my hands are in pain, and so playing piano has been a challenge this week. And so I'm working hard to not let that distract me, but there is a part of my brain that is thinking about the fact that my hands aren't working right. I think you just have to push through that stuff. But the true answer is that I think all of that work, even if it is not an emotionally satisfying thing, all of that work is worship. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes. That's such a good question. How much practice time is the question? How much practice time should you invest so that when you're on the platform leading, that you're able to be immersed in worship, essentially, I think is what you're saying. Well, here's the thing. If I am still trying to figure out how the song goes, my brain will be entirely focused on that, and I'm not going to be entering into any kind of worshipful attitude. I'll have to sort of fake that. You know what I mean? So what I say is you have to know the songs inside and out. Now, there are a couple of songs that we've done here this week, confession, that I have not felt like I have that level of confidence in and familiarity with. And so there's a guy at Christ Church of the Valley his name's Stephen Gould, and I sat in a session, a masterclass with him, where he talked about how everyone has $1 to spend in their attention. You can put $1 worth of attention at any given time while you're leading worship. And if I'm spending 90 cents on remembering how the song goes, I only have 10 cents left to remember to be engaging and thinking about what I'm singing and thinking about how I'm serving the congregation, paying attention to the rest of the band. If most of my dollar is spent, if that budget is all being blown on just trying to remember how this song goes, I'm going to be less able to accomplish all those other things. And so I always encourage worship teams and worship leaders, do the best you can to really have these songs in your bones. Just know them. Just know them inside and out. And I'm saying that as someone who's failed at that many, many, many times. There have been times where I have faked my way through a song, and I'm just like, God, I pray that you used that, because it was awful, and I have no idea what just happened. And I don't enjoy that at all. So that's my answer to that. Is I think as much as you can be prepared. The church that I come from, we had. All the members of the team had very specific things that they needed to learn. I know in some churches, the band comes together and they kind of make up arrangements, which is really fun and really rewarding if you have a consistent team and if you have time and if everyone's at the talent level where we can do that. With our situation, we just didn't have that. So everybody had specific things they needed to learn. And so as a worship leader, I had to know intimately what the electric guitar part was doing. I had to know what the alto singer was supposed to be singing so that I could coach her if she forgot her part or whatever. And so as the worship leader, I have the additional burden that I personally am happy to bear, where I'm going to be so prepared I know what everyone on stage is supposed to be doing in our circumstance. So yeah, I think we have a baptism coming up, so